There are towns in England right now where you cannot buy milk after 6 p.m. Not because the shops closed early, because there are no shops left. The butcher retired and nobody took over. The newsagent converted to holiday lets. The pharmacist moved 40 miles inland because she couldn't afford rent. And the people who remain the ones who were born there, who buried their parents there, who thought they would grow old, they are watching their home become a theme park they can no longer afford the entrance fee to. This is not a metaphor. This is Whitby. This is St. Ives. This is Padstow, Cromer, Lyme Regis, and 100 other postcodes along the English coastline where the same silent catastrophe is playing out behind charming stone walls and Instagram-worthy harbor views. The British seaside town is dying, and the weapon killing it has a 4-digit door code and 5 stars on Airbnb. The numbers behind the silence. Let's start where the devastation is clearest in the data. Across England's coastal communities, Airbnb and short-term rental listings have exploded by over 200% since 2019. In some towns, holiday rental platforms now control between 30% and 60% of all available housing stock. In St. Ives, Cornwall, a town of barely 12,000 permanent residents, there are currently more active Airbnb listings than homes available for long-term rent at any price. Read that again. More holiday lets than rental homes. In a town where people actually need to live. The average house price in Padstow has surpassed £600,000, an 87% increase in under a decade. The average local salary in Cornwall sits around £24,000 a year. That is a house-to-income ratio of 25 to 1. That is not a housing market anymore. That is a financial fortress, and the drawbridge has been pulled up permanently. Meanwhile, the government has watched this unfold for 6 years, debated it in committees, commissioned reports, issued consultations, and delivered almost nothing that changed anything on the ground. How the feeding frenzy started. To understand how we arrived here, you have to go back to the pandemic. In 2020 and 2021, Britain's cities emptied. Remote work exploded. The wealthy, those with laptops, savings accounts, and the luxury of choosing where to live, flooded into coastal towns, buying at city prices with countryside budgets. Estate agents in Cornwall reported receiving 30 offers on a single property within 48 hours of listing. Cash buyers, London investors. Families outbid by people who had never once visited the town they were purchasing in. What followed was a feeding frenzy that never ended. Once prices surged, the financial logic shifted for every landlord in every coastal postcode in England. A 2-bedroom cottage that once rented to a local nurse for £650 a month could suddenly generate £1,200 or more per weekend on Airbnb. The decision was not difficult. The nurse was handed a Section 21 notice. The cottage received a lick of paint, a wicker basket of welcome Prosecco, and a gleaming 5-star listing before the month was out. Multiply that decision by 10,000 properties across the English coastline. What you get is not a thriving holiday economy. What you get is the systematic depopulation of the working class from entire communities, carried out quietly, legally, and with devastating efficiency. The human cost nobody is counting. Newquay, Falmouth, Whitstable, Lyme Regis. These are not abstract policy problems on a government spreadsheet. These are towns where the teachers, the nurses, the shop assistants, the pub staff, the very people who make a seaside town function, have been quietly expelled. In Newquay, a local primary school lost 7 teachers in a single academic year. Not because the school was failing, because those teachers could not find anywhere within commuting distance to rent at a price they could afford. Positions were advertised and advertised for months. Classrooms ran on supply staff. A generation of children in an already economically fragile community received a fractured education because the housing market made it impossible to retain the people teaching them. In Whitby, the waiting list for social housing has reached 4 years. 4 years. In a town where vacancy rates in the private rental sector appear strong on paper because those vacancies exist, they simply exist at £1,400 a week for holidaymakers, not £900 a month for local families. The paradox is brutal and precise. These towns look occupied. The lights are on. Cars fill the car parks. The harbor looks busy on a Saturday afternoon in August, but return in January and the illusion dissolves completely. Streets of dark windows, padlocked doors. A town that performs existence for 11 weeks a year and then falls silent because no permanent population remains to keep it breathing the rest of the time. The policy failure that made this inevitable. Here is where the anger becomes justified. Because this was not accidental. This was predictable, it was predicted, and the government failed to act until the damage had already become structural. For years, housing campaigners, local councils, and community groups raised the alarm about the Airbnb effect on coastal and rural communities. The data was clear, the trajectory was obvious. What was the response? A proposal to introduce a short-term rental registration scheme, a scheme so weak, so toothless, that it carried no meaningful cap on numbers, no mandatory licensing requirements, and no enforcement mechanism that any local authority could realistically implement. Scotland moved faster. Wales introduced a licensing scheme for short-term lets in 2023. But England ran consultations while St. Ives watched its school roll shrink and its GP surgery struggled to recruit because doctors couldn't afford to live within 20 miles of the practice they were supposed to staff. The 2026 Renters' Rights Act, which promised to protect long-term tenants from no-fault evictions, has had an unintended consequence that anyone paying attention could have seen coming. Landlords, fearful of being unable to reclaim their properties from difficult tenants under the new law, have accelerated the switch to short-term holiday lets in vast numbers. The very legislation designed to protect renters pushed even more stock out of the long-term market entirely. In coastal communities across England, the number of private rental listings fell by 34% between 2023 and early 2026, not because demand collapsed, because the supply disappeared into the short-term market, where the financial returns are higher and the legal exposure is lower. The government built a dam. The water simply went around it. The identity erasure nobody talks about. There is something happening in these towns that goes beyond economics, and it is perhaps the most devastating thing of all. The communities being displaced are not simply losing housing, they are losing the lived continuity of place. The families who have fished out of Newquay for 3 generations, the pub landlord in Whitby whose grandfather opened the same pub in 1961, the elderly woman in St. Ives who has lived on the same street for 60 years and now finds herself surrounded by strangers every weekend, none of whom will remember her name come Monday morning. When a community loses its permanent population, it does not simply become less affordable. It stops being a community at all. It becomes a product, a consumed experience, a backdrop for someone else's photographs. The social infrastructure collapses with it. The GP surgery that served 4,000 patients now serves 800 because 3,200 people have left over a decade and the NHS funding formula has not kept pace. The church that ran a food bank closes because the volunteers all moved away. The local football team folds because there are not enough young men living in the town to field a squad. What is left is aesthetically beautiful and spiritually hollow. A film set without actors, a harbor town without fishermen, a community without the thing that made it one. What comes next? The forecasts for 2026 and beyond carry a particular kind of dread. Property analysts estimate that without binding legislative intervention, a hard cap on short-term rental concentrations in designated communities, or punitive council tax premiums that actually bite a further 15% to 20% of remaining long-term rental stock in coastal areas, will transition to holiday lets within the next 3 years. The tipping point in many towns has already passed. Once the permanent population falls below a critical threshold, the services that would attract people back disappear, making repopulation structurally impossible without enormous public investment that no government is currently willing to commit to. Some towns are already past saving in their current form. The question is no longer how to protect them. It is how to manage the consequences of having failed to protect them. And yet the political conversation remains almost entirely focused on urban housing crises. London, Manchester, Birmingham. The coastal towns, with their smaller populations and their postcard appearances, are politically invisible. Their residents have nowhere to go with their anger except local Facebook groups and petitions that receive sympathetic newspaper coverage and no legislative response. The question that remains, at some point, a society has to decide what it believes housing is for. If housing is purely an investment vehicle, an asset to be optimized for maximum financial return, regardless of social consequence, then what is happening to the English seaside town is not a crisis. It is the market functioning exactly as designed. But if housing is a human right, if belonging to a place, building a life in a community, raising children where your own parents raised you, if any of that holds moral weight, then what is happening along the English coastline is not the market working. It is the market winning, and an entire category of human being losing. The lights are on in those cottages every August. Someone is always there, filling the restaurants, walking the harbor, buying the fudge. They just won't be there in February. They won't be there when the school needs a teacher. They won't be there when the elderly neighbor needs someone to call. They won't be there when the thing that made the town worth visiting in the first place quietly ceases to exist. If you've watched a place you love turn into a holiday product while the people who gave it its soul were pushed out, leave your story in the comments. Because this is happening to more towns than the headlines ever name, and the more we talk about it, the harder it becomes to ignore. If this investigation opened your eyes, share it, subscribe, hit the bell. The next one goes even deeper. Disclaimer: this content is based on publicly available economic data, housing reports, and social research for the period 2025-2026. All analysis is independent and educational in nature.